I think there's a commentary in the natural health world that if you don't give birth to your baby vaginally, you're doing them a disservice. And I think that's very unfair to mothers because it puts this unrealistic expectation that we will always be able to deliver naturally, vaginally, without pain medication at home in this beautiful environment. And sometimes the world, life, your baby has different plans for how that's going to go. And that's what happened for me. Welcome to today's episode of What We Tell Our Daughters. So today it's just you and me, and we're going to be talking about my story of what it's like to give birth in a Portuguese public hospital. So if you have listened to a few episodes by now, you may have a feeling from me that I'm a bit of a crunchy granola mom. I had big dreams of having a beautiful home birth, a home water birth, and I had amazing midwives that I had found here in Portugal. And for a little bit of background, Portugal is not the most progressive place when it comes to alternative health. So there is some available. I found a massage therapist and I found an acupuncturist here. But when we first decided to move to Portugal, I was 1 month pregnant. And I was posting in Facebook groups like, where can I find a midwife? I really want to do a home birth. Where are some resources around this? And I was slammed in the comments by other women in Portugal saying, how dare you do that? It's so dangerous. You're putting your baby at risk. You're putting yourself at risk. Please don't do that. And so I was actually quite taken aback because in my mind, Europe at the time was this big blob of a giant land mass where everyone was progressive. Come to find out, that's definitely not the case, and every country is beautiful and different in its very own way. But it was very surprising to me to find that there were only about 8 midwives in the entire country of Portugal who are able to do home birth. It's a very small association. They work based on location and area. So there's like 2 midwives assigned to this entire northern Portugal area where I live. And they are beautiful and wonderful and amazing. And I was so grateful to have them through most of my pregnancy. But unfortunately, in my 39th week of pregnancy, I was diagnosed with preeclampsia. And as soon as that happens, your chances of home birth are pretty much gone because it's dangerous. And when your blood pressure goes up and the perfusion to your baby is at risk and your own health is at risk, they will no longer do a home birth for you. So I was sent immediately to the public hospital with my husband. Mind you, this was pretty heart-wrenching for me because I really came from an education and a background and kind of an indoctrination that if I don't give birth vaginally, I am doing my child a huge disservice. Now, I want to say something about that, and that is if you talked to me before I had my daughter and you asked me what I thought about C-sections, I would tell you I think they are the worst thing ever. I think that most C-sections or 99% of C-sections are not necessary. This is what I would have said before. That the vaginal birth canal is super important for a baby, for their microbiome, for helping them get the strongest start in the world, for their immune system, for so many things, for the ability to slowly deliver the placenta, for them to continue to have blood perfusion after delivery because they're still attached to the placenta, for this slow, beautiful waking up of your baby, getting to do the breast crawl, if you've never seen that, where they lay on your belly and they try to slowly find the nipple, for the beauty of being able to give birth not in a hospital, because hospitals are actually one of the most germ-ridden places we could possibly deliver a brand new baby that has no immune system. So while all of these things are true, and we have lots of research that shows this, I am here to tell you that on the other side of this experience, I had a C-section in the hospital. I had pain medication, which I would never have told myself that I would have. And I was able to breastfeed my daughter, which I'm very grateful for. And she is just fine. And truth be told, I was a C-section baby, and I'm just fine too. So I think there's a lot of there's a commentary in the natural health world that if you don't give birth to your baby vaginally, you're doing them a disservice. And I think that's very unfair to mothers because it puts this unrealistic expectation that we will always be able to deliver naturally, vaginally, without pain medication at home in this beautiful environment. And sometimes the world, life, your baby has different plans for how that's going to go. And that's what happened for me. So, in my 39th week of pregnancy, I had my labs done regularly. So I was getting tested pretty much every day to make sure that my organs didn't start to degrade, that my kidneys were still functioning okay, that there wasn't too much protein leaking out. So, for anyone who doesn't know what preeclampsia is, basically it's a condition of pregnancy where you get high blood pressure. Because of that high blood pressure, you can have organ damage to your liver, to your kidneys. You can have a much higher risk for bleeding during delivery. So that's one of the reasons they won't let you do it at home anymore. And you can actually have permanent organ damage if it goes on too long because your kidneys have to filter out your blood. And if they start to get damaged, they're not doing their job well. So it is a pretty big deal. It's monitored very closely. If it progresses, it can progress to seizures, or it can progress to something called HELP syndrome, where we have elevated liver enzymes, we have lowered platelets, so that's where that bleeding risk comes in. So it can be really dangerous. I'm very lucky that my personal case of preeclampsia was not that intense. I got to carry my baby all the way to full term. Some women are diagnosed with preeclampsia around week 20, and they have to stay in the hospital until it's safe to deliver the baby or until their condition degrades so much they have to deliver on the spot. So there's a lot of different ways this story could have gone. And I am very lucky to be on the side of preeclampsia that wasn't a long-term health issue for me, and it wasn't a huge deal for my pregnancy itself for most of it. That said, my midwives did send me immediately to the hospital as soon as my lab started to come back, showing that my kidneys were no longer functioning as well as they should. What that meant was my husband and I live in a not small town, but a kind of smallish town in Portugal. And so we drove 35 minutes to the hospital that we had chosen. So in Portugal, there are many public hospitals, but there are a few public hospitals that are well known in the country for being more willing to adhere to your birth plan, adhere to a mother's birth plan. So we'd actually pick this hospital ahead of time as a plan B, as a backup. We had a call with them around week 30 of my pregnancy to set up a birth plan. So they already knew what I wanted going into the hospital. And we arrived in the evening of that day after I'd gotten labs done to a insanely overflowingly full emergency room. Mind you, the emergency room is like the size of my office. It's like this big. There's people everywhere. There's children, there's old people, there's sick people, there's people on gurneys. It looks a little bit like a war zone in a way. It's pretty scary when you first go in. However, Portugal does really value children and pregnant women. And so they pushed me through really, really quickly. My husband wasn't allowed to go back with me for the first hour or so. They sent me up to the maternity ward where I laid down on a bed for about an hour while they just listened to the baby. And they do the sonogram where they just have the baby's heart rate going all the time. You're just laying there and they're just listening. And I think I was there for an hour, mostly just because they were so busy, they didn't have time to come back to see me. But in that time, I was completely by myself. So it was just me alone in a room, a little bit afraid, unable to have my husband there with me. And finally, the nurse came back about an hour later, looked at the graph that had printed of my baby's heart rate, looked at my labs, and they said, we're just going to have you wait. We don't have a room right now for you. Go ahead and just wait out in the waiting room. At that point, they did let my husband come up, and we waited for maybe about an hour before finally, again, the doctor came to see us and said, your labs aren't that bad, and we just don't have space for you right now. The maternity ward is overflowing. We have women who are delivering now. Come back in the morning and we'll schedule you for an induction. I was also not in labor. I had taken castor oil. This is a listen to what I say as a story, but don't do as I say unless your doctor tells you to. So castor oil is known to be something that can stimulate the bowels. It can stimulate contractions. So I had taken castor oil in the hopes that I could actually induce myself and get contractions going, because what I wanted to avoid was the drugs that induce labor. The reason for that is they can be very intense. So if you ever heard of Pitocin, that is synthetic oxytocin, which is what triggers contractions during labor. That's usually given IV. There's also one that they can insert vaginally. So there's a lot of different options. And I was hoping I could avoid those and help my body go into labor naturally. My body tried. I did have contractions for a few hours there, but nothing large enough to actually start natural labor process. So we went home and we actually had one night very grateful of some sleep. We were both very tired and we got up early the next morning to come back to the hospital for the scheduled induction. Again, remember, this is a public hospital. So we chose the public hospital in Portugal because the private hospital, if something happens and something goes wrong in a private hospital, they actually send you to the public hospital because the public hospital has more resources. Very counterintuitive, I know. If you're going in for a scheduled C-section and everything is planned out, then the private hospital is great. It's going to be a lot faster. You're not going to have to do any of this hoopla, wait around, wait and see what happens. But you also pay for it. And the private hospital was completely free, which is quite amazing. And actually, my level of care was quite amazing. I had really wonderful nurses, and we were there for almost 7 days at the end of this whole situation. So we went back the next morning, and again, it was very slow. We got there at maybe 8 a.m. and they were busy. There were babies being delivered. It was crazy. And so I didn't actually start my induction maybe until about 10 or 11 a.m. that morning. They started with a vaginal insert. So there's something called misoprostol they can put in vaginally that's supposed to soften the cervix and really start to help get your body ready to go into labor, or hopefully it can actually trigger contractions. For me, the contractions were virtually nothing. I felt almost nothing for about 12 hours. Come morning time, and I've made no progression. My cervix is slightly, maybe a little softer, but definitely not open. And they have moms coming in who really need to deliver their baby. So completely in Portuguese, we understand some Portuguese. We don't speak Portuguese perfectly. We are taking lessons, but especially at the time, we weren't super fluent in Portuguese. And the doctor didn't speak any English. So she comes in and says in very fast Portuguese, essentially something along the lines of, we have lots of babies to deliver. We don't have space for you. You need to go back out into the waiting. So we did. So they actually, instead of sending us to the waiting room, they basically just kind of put us in like a recovery room. That's a big, huge, long hallway full of curtain divided beds. So one big room for everyone. And we waited all day. And we waited for the doctor to come back and we heard nothing. And we asked the nurse and we heard nothing. And we are waiting to hear what kind of medication they want to try next, and we hear nothing. So this is a situation where you really have to advocate for yourself. You have to push, you have to keep asking to see the doctor or to talk to the doctor. I was really grateful for my history and my background in nursing so that I knew what to ask for and I knew to keep pushing this along. Finally, around 5 p.m. that day, we did get the doctor to come back. And she looked at me and she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, what do you mean? What do I want to do? I want to continue this induction so that we can get the baby out. And I think she was asking me what I wanted to do because she thought maybe I would say, like, let's just have a C-section, just get the baby out now. I was so extremely committed to my plan to have a vaginal birth with no pain medication, even if it had to be induced. There was no way you were going to get me to a C-section room unless it was like the end of the line. So we restarted with a stronger vaginal insert this time. This one worked quite well. My body really took it on fast and hard. And so instead of virtually no contractions, I had kind of the opposite. I had contractions that started coming strong and hard, about a minute apart, sometimes lasting for a minute. At times, I only had 45 seconds of rest between contractions. And these were really, really intense contractions. So these were not natural contractions. In a natural birth, you have oxytocin flowing naturally. So you don't feel as much pain. Or let's just say you have a lot more natural hormone to balance out the pain that you feel so that it's not such an intense physical reaction. With an induced birth, you have none of the natural hormones. You don't have endorphins, you have nothing to help you with pain. So my contractions came fast and hard, and I made it for about 8 hours of that. My water broke before I had essentially gone into a pain nap. My whole body was tight and tense. I couldn't really even open my eyes. It was so bad. My husband was genuinely worried about whether or not I was going to make it through this. And I finally had to say, I need pain medication. I can't do this anymore. Which, if you asked me before I went through this experience if I would ever take pain medication in birth, I would have said, absolutely no, kill me first. I will not do it. I refuse. I'm going to put my foot into the ground until I, pass out, but I'm not going to do pain medication. I was probably about one click away from actually passing out from the pain. That's when I decided if I was going to make it through, I needed pain medication. So they did. They came, they gave me an epidural. The epidural worked. For a moment, I felt this amazing relief of pain. I was like, okay, I made it. I can do this. Now we can restart this process. I can find new energy. A few minutes later, I realized I still have quite a lot of pain, but it's only on one side of my body. Come to realize the epidural only worked on half of my body, not all of it. I will say in the beginning, it was still better than nothing. It did help relieve some of that intense pressure that I had, but as time went on, I think it was basically the same as having no pain medication. So they continued to induce me with the vaginal insert that was triggering contractions, intense contractions, still coming about every minute, 45 seconds of rest, maybe a minute of rest. I think I forgot to mention that, mind you, normal contractions last for about 45 seconds, and you have about 3 minutes of rest time in between. They might last for a minute, but you usually have about 3 minutes of rest between those contractions. So this was a very medical birth, right? This was not natural in any way. Now, I had really amazing nurses. I had a few nurses who spoke English. Some of them didn't speak English, but all along the way, they were asking me what I needed. They were asking me if I was okay. They were listening to me. They were listening to my birth plan. They understood when I pushed and pushed and tried to put off pain medication as long as possible, even though they were really recommending it. Also, at this point, I forgot to mention, and I wish I had a picture to show you because it's just so ridiculous. Like, my feet were elephant feet. I was so insanely swollen and puffy from the preeclampsia because what happens is, since your kidneys stop working very well, they're not really filtering everything effectively. Your blood pressure goes up. You start to get edema, which means your whole body is super, super swollen. And so on we went for maybe another 8 hours, and I kind of stopped progressing at this point. And they decided, okay, let's go ahead and switch to Pitocin, IV Pitocin, which is a different type of induction medication. That worked better. I had slightly more rest time, which was amazing, but I was barely progressing. My cervix was hardly dilating, and I had gone through almost 3 days of labor at this point. My water had broken at 24 hours before, and the nurse came in and said, well, your water broke 24 hours ago. Now you're at risk for infection. We want to give you IV antibiotics. We want to give the baby antibiotics, and also it's time to do a C-section. Knowing what I know, there's actually not a higher risk of infection with going longer than 24 hours. You can test the baby after birth for fever. You can do a blood culture if you want to make sure, but the risk is low, and the risk of giving antibiotics to a baby who is already at risk for a C-section, already at risk for losing most of its microbiome, that was a no for me. So I refused the antibiotics, and I refused the antibiotics for my baby. And I also refused the C-section at that point. I said, just give me a few more hours. And they did. For a public hospital in Portugal, I was very impressed. If you said no in a US hospital, they would scare you. They would tell you you are doing all the things wrong. This is very dangerous. You have to give birth now. It's been more than 24 hours. We're going to take you to the OR. They're going to tell you crazy things that may or may not be true because of all of the legal liability in the US. And they're afraid that if anything goes wrong, you're going to sue them and they're going to be at risk. Versus in Portugal, the idea of suing a hospital is pretty much non-existent. So if I refuse something, it's on me. It's my choice. It's my baby. It's my health that's at risk. And I knew the risks I was taking when I said no to those things. Now, what really started to happen and what turned the tides, there are two things. One, my cervix started to swell. So instead of continuing to dilate, it was starting to become swollen from the intense pressure of my baby's head pushing against it and it not dilating enough. And later on, after giving birth and doing some research, I realized that waiting as long as I did to have the epidural probably hurt my birth process more than helped it because my body was so tight and so tense and so unable to relax into the process of letting this baby come out that may have been part of what caused that swelling in my cervix was this tensing instead of releasing and um, relaxing into the process. So that's the first thing that happened. I started to go backwards instead of forwards. The second thing that happened is my baby's heart rate started to go up. And that tells us that she's no longer compensating. She's not doing as well. She's not tolerating this experience as well. And so that was the moment, right? It's not for me, it was about me. It was about me having this beautiful, what I wanted birth experience, but it was for her too. It was everything I thought I wanted to give her. And when she spoke up and said, I'm not doing this anymore, that was when it was time to get her out and say yes to the C-section. So I did. So I said yes, and it took maybe 15 minutes for them to get me ready and take me to the OR. And my husband was able to come with me. So we were in the OR together. He was actually able to take pictures and a video of the birth, but she was amazingly healthy. And my husband got to go back to the recovery room with her immediately after birth and do skin to skin while I had to sit in recovery for about another hour before they let us all be together. So all this is to say that giving birth in a Portuguese public hospital was so much better than I might have expected it to be, that my care was amazing, that my baby is very healthy and very happy, and all of the things I thought I was afraid of in not giving her this beautiful, natural, wonderful birth was actually, I think, exactly the way that she was supposed to come into the world. I had a really amazing midwife that I talked to right before I went into the hospital, um, a friend of my mother-in-law, and she said, your baby's already chosen how she's going to come into the world. So you can relinquish that control. It's no longer up to you. I know it feels like it is. I know it feels like everything you do now is on your shoulders, but it's not. She's already made that choice. And I can tell you that after going through that experience and giving birth to my daughter in the way that she came into the world, I think it was her choice. I know her well now and I see her personality and that was how she was going to do this. It was going to be her way. It was not going to be mine. It was not going to be this calm, peaceful thing that I wanted. It was going to be a boom, bang, bang. Here I am, world. Let me shake everything up for you and make you question what you think about how things should be done. And I'm grateful for that. And from that, I have a new respect for Western medicine, one that I had lost after being a nurse for so long. I'm very grateful for this experience I had, for my daughter's health, for the wonderful nurses who listened to me and let me do things my way. And if you're considering giving birth in another country, I think it is really important for you to do some research and know what it's like to give birth there. Can you say no to certain things? What will happen if you say no to certain things? Will they push you? Will they scare you? I think to my advantage, I am American. And so I think in some ways they didn't question me maybe as much as they would have a Portuguese person. I was pretty set in the way that I wanted to do things, and I think they could tell that in their conversation with me. And so there was less space for them to push me in a certain direction. It was more like me telling them, no, this is what I'm going to do. Um, and they were willing, and they were open to it. And part of that, I also discharged myself from the hospital a day early. I don't recommend you do that, but I am a nurse and I knew how to monitor my own wounds and how to monitor my own baby. And we were in a long recovery room divided by a curtain. So we also weren't sleeping because this was a room with like 10 literally for brand newborn babies all sleeping in a room together. So there was crying and screaming all night long. There was a sick baby next to us. Like the thought of staying there any longer with my brand newborn baby that had no immune system was not on the table for me. Like we had to get out of there. So that it was about 6 days in the hospital, 3 days of labor, more or less. And on the other side of it, we're all healthy. We're all healthy. We're all here. We had a very interesting experience. Would I do it again? I have very high hopes that in my second birth, I can have a home birth and I can have a vaginal birth. And I'm going to try my very hardest to make it work. To be honest, I don't think that Portugal will allow me to try for a home birth after cesarean. It's hard enough just to do a vaginal birth after cesarean. But I'm going to fight for it. So, if you're at all curious about living in Portugal, moving to Portugal, let me know in the comments. Like that's really what this episode was about, was what is it like to not speak the language and have to deliver your baby into the world? And I think the moral of the story is wherever you live, you have to go into that experience knowing exactly what it is that you want, knowing what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. Because if you don't, you will be pushed in a certain direction that may or may not actually be what you want. So you have to know. And for me, I think I can rest peacefully from that experience knowing that I did everything in my power to help my baby come out the way that I thought was the right way. And at the end of the day, she chose something different, and that's okay. That is her choice. That's her story. This is her life. It's not mine to mold and shape. And that's kind of the first lesson of motherhood, right? We don't get to shape our children. They shape us. They show us who they are, and we just get to experience what it's like to be on their team as their parent, guiding them and leading them through the world. So I guided and I led as long as I could. And then she took over and said, this is how we're doing it, Mama. We're going a different way. And I had to say, okay, I'll be there. So I hope this episode was interesting for you. I hope maybe you learned a little bit about Portugal that you didn't know, or gave you some inspiration if you're afraid of a C-section, or if you're curious about giving birth in another country or in a different type of environment than you're normally in. Like that's what this experience of life is all about for me. And so I wasn't afraid to give birth in a foreign country where I didn't speak the language. I had enough trust and faith in my body and in the process that I knew it would be okay no matter what happened. And I would love for all women, especially pregnant women, to get to that place before it's time for you to give birth, where you have faith that will be okay and you can relinquish yourself to the process and not try to shape it too much, but know what you want. So I would love to hear if you have questions for me, and I'll see you in the next episode.